Hey everyone, I'm Christie Stratos, and actually on this channel I usually say, hi writers and readers, I'm Christie Stratos. It's been a long time. I don't typically post videos on YouTube anymore, but I've noticed that there have been a few new followers, so I thought I would just do a quick live video to give you insight into something I don't often say in interviews. And I recently realized this and was like, that would be a great topic for a video. So people often ask me, whether in interviews or just one-on-one, whatever it may be, why do I write about the Victorian era? And I always answer that I just really love it. I really enjoy the time period. Of course, I like the historical dramas, on TV. I've always loved Downton Abbey and, Forsyte drama, all kinds of things like that. Saga, excuse me. And I love everything about the time period. I often talk about how my mom had introduced me to the Victorian era by taking me to auctions when I was much younger and telling me all about mourning jewelry and things like that. And I started to really appreciate the time period overall for kind of like everything it had. And the deeper I started to do research when I decided I was going to write in it, the more I sort of enjoyed both the things that some might consider limitations and the things that some might consider being easier or more open. So obviously, when you write historical research, there's always going to be some limitations where you have to make sure that your research is on target and you have to stay within that research. You have to stay within the time period. And that's the great thing about fantasy. I often tell people who have writer's block, if you're writing something that takes a lot of research, it's great if you can write something fantastical or something that just doesn't require any research. So you can jumpstart your creativity again. You can easily get caught up in that. So what I wanted to also say is some of the things that you might consider would be the things that you don't want your characters to be able to do, or that you do want them to do, but more often that you don't want them to do, or the things that you don't want to have to research or write about. So let me explain that a little bit more. One of the things I really didn't want to do was have to have all kinds of technology and CSI type stuff when there's a mystery involved in my stories. If there's a murder or something like that, for me, I enjoy things like CSI, I enjoy watching those, but I had no interest in doing the research in making that a big part of the story and trying to figure out what would, cops or whoever be able to determine, based on how much technology we now have. That part felt very limiting and felt like my creativity would be put in the wrong place. So for me, doing something crime related today is not as interesting for me as a writer. I like to read it. I don't necessarily want to write about it. So that was definitely a big determining factor. You will find that a lot of the things that I write in contemporary fiction, they require research. Yes, they require research, but it's not the same as like high-tech stuff or anything. It's stuff that I'm either familiar with, or I can just do some general research and find out what the answer is. And that's kind of where it ends. And the focus is really on the character development, less spending all kinds of time researching, the technicalities of things. So of course, when you're doing something like the Victorian era, things were moving very fast. A lot of times people think of Victorian era as, oh, it's an older time period. And, there just wasn't as much going on, but that's actually kind of untrue. It's kind of the opposite. If I'm going to write in 1850, and then I want to jump ahead to 1855, surprisingly, I'm going to have to research 1855 in particular, because there have been a lot of developments in the meantime. A lot of people don't quite realize how much effort that does take, but that should not deter you if you're interested in writing in an older time period. The research can be so fascinating. And one of the things I found as I was going over one of my drafts for Brotherhood of Secrets was I had to look up what was like doable in terms of figuring out the crime. Could they even look at fingerprints? Did they have that capability? I had to look at that and find that out. That did cause a bit of a problem because there were certain beliefs about fingerprints at the time. I believe it was something along the lines of they only thought there were 7 types of fingerprints. So like, sure, they could kind of maybe identify whether you had one of the 7 types of fingerprints, that they knew about at the time. But it wasn't the same as today, where if you have a fingerprint, you have a fingerprint, and that's that, identifying factor. There weren't the same kinds of things with, blood analysis and things like that. Different types of people were sent out to the crime scene in the Victorian era than now. There was a very different procedure. Frankly, you could get away with a lot more in a time period, that's older, where there just weren't those technical capabilities, technology related capabilities. And so for me, it's a little bit easier to develop a crime and have somebody get away with it, because yes, I have to think around like, okay, what would they have to burn and what would they have to clean? Like any clothing, sure, that would need to be burned, but maybe, you couldn't have detectives necessarily gathering like one teeny tiny piece of that clothing and putting it through an array of machines, to figure out when it was made and where it came from or anything like that we enjoyed so much on CSI. Not wanting to deal with that stuff definitely helped make my decision to write in the Victorian era a lot easier. I enjoy figuring out what people knew and what they didn't know. And it can cause a lot of very interesting details. Like you can put in a lot of interesting details into the Victorian era novels that you might not actually put into a modern novel where everybody knows this stuff or typically knows this stuff. So like another determining factor would be, let's step away from the crime scenes. If you want characters to not have the ease of using cell phones, you can step back not that far, actually. It doesn't have to be all the way into the Victorian era. You could step back into the 1950s, or something like that, where communication was, of course, more difficult. You see, people would have to call each other, and they were still writing letters and even sending telegrams and things like that to get in contact. It was not as easy to get in contact with somebody. So if you don't want to have the struggle of like, oh, well, this character could just text that character and have this over with, or just call them on their cell phone and find out, or use Find My iPhone or something in one way or another, you may want to consider the time period for that as well. There are just a lot of conveniences to consider that may help place your piece. Never mind like clothing and simple things like that. But, things like that can really help place your piece. The types of things, maybe your piece will rely heavily on the type of access people had to travel. That makes a big difference. I mean, things changed quickly, but over time. But things are obviously, it's way easier to travel, not during coronavirus necessarily, but it's way easier to travel now than it was, not that long ago. There are many factors to consider, especially if you're doing an outline and you have kind of an idea of where you're going anyway. You can kind of figure out like, what does this character absolutely need, and what do I want them not to have in order to accomplish this piece and make it really interesting and have it be accurate. That's one of the things I've definitely seen in some books, like where in the 80s, a book will take place in the 80s and it'll have like everybody having cell phones and stuff like that, and that's not realistic. So of course it loses a point of credibility there and accuracy. So these are things to definitely think about. And while that may seem limiting, it's actually, in my opinion, more exciting because it gives you more authenticity, more interest, and more opportunity to really put the piece in that time period, make it very interesting, make it a bit different maybe from everything else that's out there, or make sure that your piece kind of plays to the time period, or vice versa, the time period plays the piece. So anyway, those are just a few insights, maybe a bit rambly, but I find it very interesting to kind of delve into these things and how we decide to write in different time periods. So if you're struggling with that, maybe this video will help you. Maybe you have something to add down below in the comments. Either way, I hope you found it interesting, and I'll see you the next time I decide to do a video. If you have something that you'd like to see from me, let me know. And I do a lot more videos on Patreon, which you can join for as little as $1 a month. You can find the link down below. And for $1 a month, you get an awful lot of stuff. So make sure that you check it out, and I will see you next time. Bye, everyone.